Yesterday, House Democrats removed $1 billion in funding for Israel's Iron Dome air defense system from their stopgap government funding bill. Progressives threatened to tank the measure over the military support for Israel. According to a spokesperson for House Appropriations Committee Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro, funding for the Iron Dome, quote, will be included in the final bipartisan and bicameral defense funding bill later this year. Joining us now to discuss the potential impact of this is Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Welcome, Trita.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, first of all, I think what a lot of people are wondering as they're seeing this news is, why can't Israel afford an Iron Dome, and why is the United States paying for it in the first place?
Israel certainly can afford to pay for this on its own. In fact, one of the things that differentiates Israel from some of the other U.S. partners in the region who are terrified of the idea of the United States leaving the region militarily is that those other countries have essentially financed their own dependency on the United States. And without the United States, they are objectively going to be in a worse position because they haven't prepared themselves for this scenario. Israel never went down that path. It has always pursued a policy of seeking to be able to stand up its own defenses on its own. It doesn't say no to help or charity from the United States or any requests it, but does it actually need it? No, it has pursued a strategy in which it would be able to survive without it. And certainly at this point, it does make a lot of sense in my view that as the United States is seeking to withdraw from the region and reduce its military engagement there, that those countries that actually can afford to stand up their own defenses should do so on their own.
So, and just a little bit of pushback came from Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin, who's a Democrat member of the House Armed Services Committee, who noted that this isn't additional funding, it's continued funding that resulted from a 2016 communique between the Obama administration and the Israeli government, noting as well that Iron Dome was developed collaboratively between the U.S. and the Israelis as a purely defensive system to help them from incoming rocket attacks from Hamas and other outside groups. I think there's certainly a case that could be made that we invest in most of our allies' mutual defense. NATO, for example, is something where we support our European Western allies to a significant degree in their defense budgets. Doing similarly in Israel doesn't seem to be a bridge much further. But I guess I'm curious why this is suddenly targeted, since it's something that we've the U.S. government has funded for over a decade. I don't know if that actually, Ryan, that might be something you have a perspective on as a progressive.
I do, but I'm curious for Trita's take on this. But yeah, I'll give you my thought in a second.
Yes.
All right. Well, first, I think it's a good question, and I think I'm very pleased that you mentioned NATO, because at the end of the day, that needs to change as well. The Europeans are in a very strong financial position to be able to stand up their own defenses on their own. Instead of relying so much on the defense umbrella, security umbrella that the United States is providing them, that is costing U.S. taxpayers a tremendous amount of resources. And this is a complaint that has come from the U.S. side for quite some time. This is not just something that Trump brought up, but Obama himself brought up the idea that Europeans were not paying enough. So again, I think there is a parallel there. And just as much as there should be an end to some of this funding, mindful of the fact that the Israelis can pay for it themselves, the same thing actually applies to the Europeans. So there should be consistency there. I agree with that. The reason I think this is coming up at this point is because within Democratic ranks, particularly amongst progressives, there is a tremendous amount of frustration that there is no movement on the Israeli-Palestinian front, that the Israeli government has dug in its heels, is essentially de facto annexing parts of the Palestinian territories, and the United States should not be financing that, mindful of the fact that it undermines U.S. interests in the region.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that the left flank of the House Democrats in particular don't believe that Israel is genuinely on some type of peace path, some type of the two-state strategy at this point is just a complete fig leaf. And if anybody advocates for a one-state solution, they get called an anti-Semite. At the same time, the politics are such that Netanyahu took Israeli politics into the Republican camp. But a number of centrist Democrats have maintained close ties with with pro-Israel or Israeli hawkish organizations, whereas groups like Democratic Majority for Israel raise and spend millions and millions of dollars in primaries against people like Nina Turner recently, against Ilhan Omar, against Jamal Bowman. So this is now an open kind of domestic political fight, and there's little reason at this point there's little upside for progressive Democrats to say, sure, let's go on record supporting billions more for Israel's military-industrial complex.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. I ask only because. Go ahead. Yes.
Just one small point. I think also we have to look forward to see, okay, what does this mean going forward? And will this at some point end if we don't end it now? And earlier on, when the Iron Dome was first set up and it was tested in 2014, when the Israelis were bombarding Gaza, and the Gaza rockets were far fewer at the time, and the Iron Dome was proven quite effective against them. In this last flare-up in which the Israelis were bombing Gaza and the Hamas was hitting Israel, it was a very different story because the technology on the Hamas side had changed, mainly because of technology provided to them, drones and other things from the Iranians. And Iron Dome was not that effective. So those supporters of this will then make the argument, okay, now we need to make more investments in order to make sure that the Israelis have a more effective response to the new technology that exists on the Hamas side. The question is, when does this end then? For how long should U.S. taxpayers fight and pay for this conflict to continue rather than pay for this conflict to end? And that's where I think the problem lies right now. And I think I'm not surprised to see that the progressives are reacting against this. I'm actually more surprised that the right, that otherwise is very keen on ending funding to NATO, for instance, is not targeting this.
So yesterday, Joe Biden spoke at the United Nations General Assembly and called for global unity against common threats.
Will lead on all the greatest challenges of our time, from COVID to climate, peace and security, human dignity and human rights, but we will not go it alone. We will lead together with our allies and partners and in cooperation with all those who believe as we do that this is within our power to meet these challenges.
The president also denounced wars, saying in part, many of our greatest concerns cannot be solved or even addressed by the force of arms. Bombs and bullets cannot defend against COVID-19 or its future variants. Trita, what did you make of the president's remarks yesterday at the UN General Assembly?
I think there were a lot of very good lines, very good points. The question, though, is, will the rhetoric, will the policy match the rhetoric? I think the president is absolutely right. You can't bomb COVID. He's absolutely right when he said earlier on that the withdrawal from Afghanistan would mean an end to an era of trying to change countries and their political makeup through force. The problem is we have to see it in practice, not just in the rhetoric. Of course, give full credit for Biden for pulling out of Afghanistan, but I'm really curious to see, what does that line mean? Will it mean that we will also withdraw from Iraq? Will it mean that we will end an unauthorized war and a military presence in Syria? Will we really put pressure on the Saudis to end the war in Yemen? So a lot of this is excellent rhetoric. I'm very glad that he's saying it, but it remains to be seen whether it will be translated accurately into practice.
Oh. Interesting questions. Trita, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.